Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today, we are continuing the storyline, titled Dead Embers. This is Episode 2. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
The storm did not arrive in Oakhaven, it conquered it. By 2 in the morning, the freezing sleet had crystallized into a dense, blinding wall of white that swallowed the Pacific Northwest town whole. The wind shrieked through the valley, tearing dead branches from the towering Douglas firs and hurling them against rooftops with the force of artillery. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in less than 3 hours, freezing the mud of the logging roads into treacherous, jagged ruts before burying them beneath 2 feet of rapidly accumulating snow. Park Ranger Maya Lin gripped the steering wheel of her heavy-duty patrol cruiser, her knuckles white. The vehicle's defroster was screaming, blasting dry, hot air against the windshield, but the ice was still creeping in at the corners of the glass. The headlights cut a pathetic 10-foot cone into the whiteout. Beyond that, the world simply ceased to exist. She was creeping along County Road 9 at a grueling 5 miles per hour. The county snowplows had officially retreated an hour ago, their dispatchers declaring the conditions too dangerous even for the massive chained-up rigs. Oakhaven was now entirely severed from the outside world. The highway passes to the east were blocked by avalanches, and the winding mountain roads to the south were buried. "Dispatch, this is Lynn," Maya said, pulling her shoulder mic close to her mouth so she could be heard over the roar of the heater and the howling wind. "I just dropped old man Henderson off at his property. His Buick is in a snowbank a mile back. I'm turning the cruiser around and heading for the station to hunker down. Visibility is near zero." Static popped harshly in her ear, followed by the faint, stressed voice of the night dispatcher. "Copy that, Maya. Take it slow. We just lost power on the east side of town. The grid is struggling. I'm showing you as the last unit on the road. Get back safe." "Will do. Lynn out." Maya carefully negotiated a 3-point turn, feeling the heavy studded tires of the cruiser slip and slide before finding purchase on the frozen asphalt hidden beneath the snow. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, allowing her shoulders to drop just a fraction. She was exhausted. Her uniform was damp with melted snow, and the heavy boots she wore felt like lead weights. But as she drove, scanning the impenetrable white for fallen timber, she felt a profound sense of relief that the town was tucked in. Nobody was going anywhere. The isolation of Oakhaven was absolute. 5 miles down in the valley, nestled on the quietest edge of Main Street, the Oakhaven Veterinary Clinic was a solitary beacon of light against the storm. Inside the back office, Dr. Aris Thorne sat at his cluttered mahogany desk, bathed in the warm yellow glow of a desk lamp. The clinic was silent save for the rhythmic rattling of the old window panes and the deep, even snoring of a golden retriever recovering from surgery in the kennel room down the hall. Aris was nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He was staring at the screen of his laptop, scrolling through a secure medical database he still had access to from his days as a researcher in Seattle. He wasn't looking at local wildlife statistics. He was looking at international epidemiological bulletins. Despite his earlier dismissal at the diner, the news reports of the viral anomaly in Africa had nagged at the back of his clinical mind. Aris was a man who found comfort in logic, in the predictable patterns of nature. Nature was cruel, but it followed rules. Viruses adapted, they spread, and they burned out. But the data he was reading on the screen defied the standard rules of virology. The WHO field reports from the Congo Basin detailed a pathogen tentatively classified as a highly mutated lysovirus. Aris knew the lysovirus genus intimately. It was the family of RNA viruses responsible for rabies. He had seen it in foxes, raccoons, and feral dogs. He knew its tragic slow march up the peripheral nerves to the brain. But this new strain, this anomaly, was staggering in its efficiency. The field notes described an incubation period of days, sometimes hours, rather than weeks or months. The virus was somehow bypassing the peripheral nervous system and crossing the blood-brain barrier with terrifying speed. More disturbing were the behavioral symptoms. Standard rabies-induced confusion, hydrophobia, and aggression, but it also rapidly crippled the host. The infected animal quickly lost its motor functions, stumbling and paralyzing before death. This new lysovirus variant, however, seemed to preserve the host's motor cortex while entirely hijacking the amygdala. The reports described infected primates exhibiting coordinated hyperviolent behavior, pursuing uninfected targets with predatory focus before cardiovascular collapse finally brought them down. Aris rubbed his tired eyes, pushing the laptop away. It was a fascinating, horrifying piece of evolutionary biology. He could easily picture his former colleagues in the city, fueled by espresso and ambition, scrambling to sequence the genome and publish papers on it. He was glad to be out of that race. Let the global health organizations deal with the terrifying anomalies of the world. In Oakhaven, the biggest medical crisis of the night was making sure old Mrs. Gable's coonhound didn't scratch at his porcupine wounds. The heavy front door of the clinic groaned open, instantly letting in the scream of the wind and a flurry of snow before slamming shut. Heavy snow-caked boots thudded against the linoleum of the waiting room. Aris stood up, walking out of his office. Sheriff Elias Vance was standing in the lobby, brushing a thick layer of snow off his heavy shearling coat. His face was red from the cold, and his breath plumed in the cool air of the entryway. "Elias," Aris said, surprised, "what are you doing out in this mess? I thought you'd be manning the fort at the station." "Power's flickering all over town," Elias said, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the quiet clinic. He unbuckled his duty belt and set it on a waiting room chair, clearly intending to stay for a minute. "The substation on Miller's Road is freezing up. We'll be on generator power before sunrise. Just doing the rounds, making sure the critical buildings are secure. You got your backups fueled?" "Check them this afternoon," Aris nodded, motioning for Elias to follow him back to the office. "Generators are topped off. I've got enough diesel to keep the medicine coolers and the heat running for a week." Elias followed him, sinking heavily into the worn leather armchair opposite Aris's desk. He let out a long sigh of relief as the ambient heat of the room soaked into his bones. "A week might be exactly what we need. I just got off the radio with the state patrol. Both highway passes are buried under 10 feet of snow. They're predicting another 12 inches by tomorrow afternoon. We are officially cut off from the rest of Washington." "Just another winter in Oakhaven," Aris said, pulling a fresh mug from a drawer and pouring the last of the lukewarm coffee from his carafe, handing it across the desk. "Yeah, just another winter," Elias agreed, wrapping his massive hands around the mug. He looked toward the rattling window, staring out into the blackness. "I just hope Caleb made it to the cabin before the worst of it hit. I've been a sheriff a long time, Aris, and I haven't seen a storm drop temperature this fast since the blizzard of '98. Aris felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Caleb was capable, more capable in the woods than any man alive, but the wild was unforgiving, and hubris was often a trapper's downfall. He knows the mountain, Aris said, trying to convince himself as much as Elias. He has the satellite phone. If he got in trouble, he would call. 30 miles away at an elevation of 5,000 feet, Caleb Thorne was not thinking about satellite phones. He was focused entirely on the ancient, rhythmic task of building a fire. The journey up the logging road had been brutal. Even with chains on the tires, his heavy Ford had started to slide dangerously close to the steep embankments. He had been forced to abandon the truck 2 miles early, unloading his snowmobile in a blinding whiteout. The ride to the cabin had been a battle of endurance, fighting the wind that threatened to push him off the narrow mountain trail into the deep ravines below. But he had made it. His grandfather's cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines, its thick log walls having withstood a century of brutal Pacific Northwest winters. Inside, the cabin was a single, large room that smelled of dry cedar, old ash, and kerosene. Caleb struck a match, touching it to the wick of an oil lantern on the wooden table. The warm, orange light flared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls adorned with snowshoes, traps, and dried herbs. He knelt before the cast-iron wood stove, carefully arranging kindling over a nest of crumpled newspaper. With another match, the paper caught, the flames licking hungrily at the dry wood. Within minutes, the stove was radiating a fierce, beautiful heat. Caleb stripped off his heavy, snow-crusted parka, his thick gloves, and his frozen boots, letting out a long groan of relief. This was his sanctuary. Down in the valley, people were huddling in their homes, worrying about power grids and blocked roads. Up here, Caleb was a king in his own isolated domain. He had enough cured firewood to last 2 months, a pantry stocked with dried meat and beans, and an ocean of pristine wilderness at his doorstep. He walked to the single window of the cabin, wiping away the condensation with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. The glass was freezing to the touch. Outside, the blizzard was a terrifying, beautiful force of nature. The wind howled with a deep baritone resonance as it ripped through the valley. But as Caleb watched the snow pile up against the tree line, a subtle unease began to creep into his chest. He was a man who lived by his senses, tuned to the minute frequencies of the forest. Even in a blizzard, the woods had a rhythm. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow. The wind whistled through the needles. But beneath the roar of the storm, there was an unnatural void. There were no tracks, no desperate scrambling of squirrels seeking shelter in the eaves, no distant haunting calls of the gray wolves that usually hunted the northern ridge. The forest wasn't just weathering the storm. It felt entirely devoid of life. It felt abandoned. Caleb frowned, turning away from the window. He walked over to his canvas duffel bag, pulling out the heavy military-grade satellite phone. He checked the battery. Fully charged. The digital screen glowed an icy blue in the dim cabin. He thought about calling Aris, just to tell his older brother he had made it, to ease the inevitable worrying. But as his thumb hovered over the power button, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the groaning of an overstressed pine tree, but it was too rhythmic, too metallic. Caleb paused, tilting his head toward the heavy timber door. The sound grew louder, a sputtering, choking mechanical whine that seemed to be vibrating through the freezing air. It was an engine. Caleb walked to the door, pulling it open against the force of the wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow. instantly freezing the sweat on his forehead. He stepped out onto the small covered porch, squinting up into the blinding white sky. The sound was directly overhead. It was the desperate, grinding roar of a twin-engine aircraft pushing itself far past the point of mechanical failure. "What the hell are you doing?" Caleb whispered to himself, his breath snatched away by the wind. Flying a small aircraft over the Cascades during a severe winter advisory was nothing short of suicidal. The downdrafts alone could snap the wings off a Cessna, but this plane wasn't flying. It was falling. Through a momentary break in the blinding snow, Caleb saw it. A shadow, darker than the storm, dropping at a terrifying angle toward Blackwood Ridge, just 3 miles to the east of his cabin. The plane was entirely dark, no navigation lights, no strobe. It was just a heavy piece of dead metal plunging toward the earth. The right engine was coughing out thick black smoke that the wind instantly shredded into nothingness. Caleb gripped the porch railing as the plane disappeared behind the jagged tree line of the ridge. 3 seconds later, the earth shuddered. The sound of the impact was swallowed almost entirely by the blizzard, arriving as a deep, percussive thud that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. A faint, terrible flash of orange illuminated the eastern sky for a fraction of a second before the relentless white of the snow instantly buried the light. Silence rushed back in, save for the howling wind. Caleb didn't hesitate. He lunged back inside the cabin, slamming the heavy door shut behind him. He grabbed the satellite phone, his large thumbs clumsily punching in the emergency frequency for the Oakhaven dispatch. He held the bulky plastic to his ear, listening to the agonizingly slow digital dial tone as the phone searched the turbulent atmosphere for a satellite connection. Down in the valley, he knew Elias and Maya were likely drinking coffee, believing the night's drama was over. "Come on, pick up," Caleb muttered, his eyes darting to his gear. The line clicked, followed by a burst of heavy static, and then the dispatcher's voice. "Oakhaven Emergency Dispatch. This is a restricted frequency." "Barb, it's Caleb Thorne," Caleb barked, cutting her off. "Patch me through to Elias and Maya immediately. I need them on the line right now." "Caleb, your brother said you were up on the mountain. Hang on, patching you into the main repeater." A moment later, Elias's voice boomed through the small speaker, sharp and alert. "Caleb, are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm at the cabin, Elias," Caleb said, pulling his heavy winter boots back on, balancing the phone between his shoulder and his ear. "I'm fine, but I just watched a twin-engine plane go down over Blackwood Ridge, about 3 miles east of my position. It looked like a hard crash, fireball and everything." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of Maya's voice cutting in from her cruiser. "Caleb, this is Maya. Are you sure? Radar out of Seattle didn't show any commercial traffic over our airspace. They grounded everything hours ago." "It wasn't commercial, Maya. It was flying dark, low under the storm cell, trying to evade the worst of the weather. It clipped the ridge. I felt the impact." Back in the clinic, Aris was standing beside Elias, his face pale. "Caleb, you stay put. Do you hear me? You are in the middle of a whiteout. You can't see 10 feet in front of you." "Aris, if there's anyone alive in that fuselage, they have maybe an hour before the cold kills them," Caleb argued, pulling his thick insulated parka back on and zipping it to his chin. "Elias, Maya can't get the cruiser up here. The logging roads are completely impassable. The county plows gave up hours ago." "Caleb is right," Maya's voice came through the static, filled with frustrated urgency. I'm down in the valley. It would take me 6 hours on foot just to reach the fire road trailhead. He's the only one in range. Elias let out a heavy breath, the sound carrying over the digital connection. He hated it, but Maya was right. In the deep woods, you relied on whoever was closest. All right, Caleb, listen to me. You take your snowshoes, you take your rifle, and you take your emergency beacon. You do not take unnecessary risk. If the terrain is too steep or the snow is too deep, you turn back. Understand? You don't become a second casualty for us to find in the spring. Understood, Sheriff, Caleb said, grabbing his medical kit and stuffing it into a small canvas rucksack. I'll leave the sat phone on to track my GPS coordinates, but I won't be able to talk while I'm moving. The wind is too loud. I'll call you when I reach the wreckage. Be careful, little brother, Aris said, his voice tight with an anxiety he couldn't hide. Always am, Doc, Caleb replied, his hand resting on the bolt-action rifle leaning against the wall. He terminated the call, slipping the heavy phone into the waterproof pocket of his coat. He strapped on his headlamp, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from his toolkit. If the fuselage was crushed, he might need leverage to get anyone out. Caleb pushed the cabin door open, leaning his entire body weight into the screaming wind to force it shut behind him. He stepped off the porch and sank waist deep into the fresh powder. He strapped on his snowshoes, his movements precise and mechanical, honed by years of surviving in the frozen wild. He looked toward the east, toward the dark, jagged silhouette of Blackwood Ridge. The snow was falling so thickly it felt like trying to breathe underwater. He had no idea who was flying that plane, or why. They were so desperate to cross the mountains in the middle of the night that they would risk a severe winter advisory. As he began the grueling trek into the white abyss, surrounded by the unnatural dead silence of the forest, Caleb Thorne had no way of knowing that the isolation of Oakhaven had just been violently broken. The storm had not kept the world out. It had only locked them in with what had just arrived.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series as the residents of Oakhaven investigate the mysterious plane crash. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for listening.